The silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs of 20 of the most brilliant minds on the continent. These weren't just analysts. They were architects of shadow empires, men and women who could move billions with a keystroke and disappear a city's worth of evidence before breakfast. They sat under the flickering fluorescent lights of the sub-basement boardroom, their brows slick with sweat, staring at the digital display on the wall. A sequence of numbers, a geometric cipher that protected the coordinates of a shipment worth more than the GDP of a small nation, sat unsolved. The clock in the corner of the screen was a digital guillotine, 4:12, for 11. If that timer hit 0, the encryption would collapse into a self-destructing loop, erasing the keys forever. And sitting at the head of the table, his fingers laced together like a prayer he didn't believe in, was Dominic Toretto Corleone. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He simply watched the screen with eyes that looked like cold, wet obsidian. The experts knew the rule. In Dominic's world, failure wasn't a firing offense. It was an invitation to a shallow grave. Then the door clicked. It was a sound so mundane it felt like a gunshot. A silver tray rattled. The scent of oversteeped Earl Grey tea cut through the smell of ozone and desperation. Ellen Ripley Gump didn't look up. She couldn't. Her world was currently reduced to the 3-inch space in front of her shoes. Her white apron was starched so stiffly it could have stood on its own, and her hands, small, pale and trembling, gripped the tray until her knuckles turned the color of bone. She wasn't supposed to be there. The floor manager had told her to stay in the kitchen. But the tray in the kitchen had been arranged incorrectly. The sugar packets were stacked in sets of 5, but one set had only 4. The imbalance had started as a tickle in the back of her brain, then a hum, then a screaming siren that made her skin feel like it was crawling with fire. He had to fix it. He had to move. And as she entered the room, the screaming in her head shifted. It wasn't the sugar packets anymore. It was the screen. The numbers on the wall were wrong. Not just mathematically, they were aesthetically offensive. A prime number was sitting next to an even integer in a way that felt like a physical blow to her stomach. The sequence was a jagged tooth in a mouth of perfect glass. "Get out," one of the experts hissed, his voice cracking with the fear of Dominic's gaze. Ellen didn't move. She couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the third line of code. It was a 7. It should have been a 4. If it wasn't a 4, the world was going to tilt off its axis. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches. The tray in her hands began to tilt. "I said out," the man snarled, rising from his chair. Dominic raised a single finger. The room went dead. He didn't look at the expert. He looked at the girl. He saw the way her eyes darted, the way her chest heaved, the way she looked at the screen not with confusion, but with a terrifying, localized agony. "Let her speak," Dominic whispered. His voice was a velvet rasp. Ellen didn't speak. She dropped the tray. The crash of china echoed like a tectonic shift. She lunged for the digital whiteboard, her fingers blurring as she swiped at the interface. The experts gasped, moving to grab her, but Dominic's hand went to the holster beneath his jacket, a silent command to stay back. In 60 seconds, exactly 60 beats of a panicked heart, Ellen's fingers danced. She deleted, she rearranged, she forced the chaos into a symmetry that finally, mercifully, allowed her to breathe. 3:01, 3 o'clock. The screen flashed green. The cipher dissolved. The coordinates blossomed onto the screen in perfect golden clarity. The room froze. The elite strategists looked from the screen to the trembling waitress who was now obsessively wiping a smudge of her own fingerprint off the glass with the hem of her apron. Dominic Toretto Corleone stood up slowly. He didn't look at the coordinates. He looked at Ellen, whose eyes were still downcast, her shoulders shaking with the aftershocks of a sensory overload they couldn't begin to understand. He didn't see a sick girl. He saw a weapon. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice softer than it had ever been. Ellen didn't answer. She was too busy counting the floor tiles to make sure they were still even. "Hello, my wonderful friends. I am so incredibly happy to have you here with me today for this journey. Before we dive deeper into the mystery of Ellen's mind and the dangerous world she's just stumbled into, I want to take a moment to say hello. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how far our community reaches. I hope you're all doing amazing. If you're enjoying this story so far, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. It helps me keep bringing these emotional stories to life for you, and I'd love to have you as a permanent part of our family here. Are you ready to see what happens when a man who controls everything meets a woman who can't even control her own thoughts? Let's continue. The basement air was filtered and recycled, but to Ellen Ripley Gump, it felt like breathing through wet wool. She didn't look at the 20 men staring at her with a mix of resentment and awe. Instead, her world was focused on the silver tray she had dropped. The shards of the teacup lay in a chaotic scatter. 17 large pieces, 24 small splinters. It was an odd number. It was an uneven disaster. She dropped to her knees, her fingers moving with a frantic rhythmic precision to gather the porcelain. "Leave it," Dominic Toretto Corleone commanded. Ellen flinched. The sound of his voice was deep, like the low hum of a high-voltage transformer. To anyone else, Dominic was a man of calculated violence and infinite wealth, a figure who had ascended the throne of the city's underworld not through luck, but through a terrifying ability to see the board 10 moves ahead. But to Ellen he was simply a loud noise in a room that was already too loud. It's not right," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the server racks. "The pieces. They aren't in their groups." Dominic stepped closer. His expensive leather shoes entered her field of vision, polished to a mirror shine. He knelt not out of humility but out of a predator's curiosity. He watched her arrange the broken shards by size and color, her breathing hitching every time a piece didn't fit her internal logic. "You saw the error," Dominic said, ignoring his advisors who were whispering urgently about security protocols. 20 men with PhDs from MIT and Stanford spent 6 hours staring at that board. They saw a wall. You saw a door. How? Ellen finally looked up, and for a second, Dominic felt a rare jolt of something that wasn't calculated. Her eyes were wide, a pale, haunting blue, but they weren't focused on him. They were darting frantically across his face, counting his eyelashes, measuring the symmetry of his collar. "It was screaming," she said, her voice trembling. "The 7. It didn't belong. It was a 7 in a sequence of 4s. It was like a thorn in a palm. I just had to pull it out so the humming would stop." Dominic studied her. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Power, money, protection. But this girl looked like she wanted to crawl out of her own skin. He saw the raw red skin on her knuckles, the result of overwashing, a compulsion to be clean in a world she felt was inherently filthy. "What's your name?" "Ellen." "I'm just the morning shift tea service. I'm sorry. I'll go and I won't come back." "No," Dominic said, standing up and offering a hand that she was too terrified to take. "You aren't going anywhere near a kitchen again." Life for Ellen had always been a series of cages. Growing up, her mind had been a labyrinth of rules. Don't step on the cracks. Tap the doorframe 4 times. Count the stairs. If she didn't, she felt a crushing sense of impending doom, a certainty that her mother would get sick or the house would burn down. Doctors called it obsessive-compulsive disorder. Ellen called it the tide. It was always coming in, and she was always building sandcastles to keep it back. She lived in a tiny apartment where everything was color-coded. Her books were arranged by height. Her canned goods had the labels facing exactly 45 degrees to the left. It was the only way she felt safe. Loneliness was a small price to pay for the silence the routines brought her. But now she was in a world where nothing was silent. Dominic moved her into a suite in his private estate. It was a palace of marble and glass, cold and intimidating. He didn't lock her in, but the guards at every door made the message clear. He brought her puzzles, encrypted ledgers, logistics manifests that didn't add up, intercepted communications from rival families. "Fix them," he would say, sitting in the corner of the room, nursing a glass of bourbon, just watching her. At first, Ellen was paralyzed. But then she saw the data. To her, a corrupted file wasn't a technical problem, it was a physical itch. A mismatched ledger was a stain on a white rug. She worked because she had to. She solved a 3-year-old money laundering discrepancy in 40 minutes because the decimal points were shouting at her. Dominic was fascinated. He began to spend more time in her suite than in his own office. He brought her gifts, not jewelry or silks, but things he noticed she craved. A set of precision pens. A high-end air purifier. A clock that ticked so silently it was almost invisible. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one night. She was sitting on the floor, organizing his collection of vintage coins by the year they were minted. Dominic looked at her. For the first time, the boss wasn't there. There was just a man who had spent his life in chaos, looking at a woman who was a slave to order. "My whole life is a mess of lies and blood, Ellen," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Everyone I know is waiting for me to slip. But you can't help but be perfect. You don't know how to lie to the numbers. I've never met anyone more honest." He reached out, his thumb grazing her cheek. Ellen froze. Her mind screamed about the bacteria on his skin, the breaking of her personal perimeter, the unpredictability of the gesture. But then something strange happened. The tide in her head, the constant rushing noise of her compulsions, went quiet. The warmth of his hand was a singular point of focus. It was an anchor. "I'm not perfect," she whispered, a tear escaping and tracking a path through the invisible dust on her face. "I'm broken." "Then we're a matched set," Dominic replied. "My friends, isn't it heart-wrenching to see someone struggle so much internally while the world only sees their talent? We're just getting started with Ellen and Dominic's journey. If you're finding yourself rooting for Ellen already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us tell more stories like this one. And I'd love to know, have you ever felt like your greatest weakness was actually a secret strength? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Let's get back to the story because things are about to get a lot more dangerous. The honeymoon period of Ellen's new life, if you could call a life lived in a gilded cage a honeymoon, shattered on a Tuesday. For Ellen, Tuesdays were blue days. She wore her blue sweater, ate blueberries for breakfast, and ensured the temperature in her room was exactly 72 degrees. It was the only way to keep the looming sense of catastrophe at bay. Dominic had grown accustomed to her rhythms. He had even started to find a strange, meditative peace in them. He would sit with her while she worked through complex datasets, his presence acting as a stabilizer. But on this Tuesday, the air in the estate felt charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. "Ellen," Dominic said, entering her study. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Frankie Costello-Vane, his most trusted enforcer, and a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of granite. Frankie held a charred, half-melted hard drive in a vacuum-sealed bag. "The port authorities intercepted a ghost shipment," Dominic explained, his voice tight. "My rivals, the Moretti family, have been using a new routing system. We recovered this from a burning warehouse in the docks. My best tech guys say the data is corrupted beyond repair. They say the encryption is organic. It changes every time you try to bypass it." He placed the bag on her desk, right in the center of her perfectly aligned blotter. Ellen stared at the drive. Just looking at the melted plastic made her skin itch. It was messy. It was asymmetrical. It was wrong. She felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the frantic need to fix the chaos. "I can't, it's dirty, Dominic," she whispered, her hands starting to twitch in her lap. "It's broken. I can't look at it." "Ellen, look at me," Dominic said, stepping into her space. He took her shaking hands in his. This was the romance they had built. A bridge made of her need for stability and his need for her brilliance. "The shipment on that drive contains more than just contraband. It contains the names of the moles in my organization. If I don't get those names, I'm a dead man walking. And if I fall, there's no one left to protect you. No one to keep your world quiet." The stakes were suddenly violently real. This wasn't just a puzzle anymore. It was a lifeline. Ellen took a deep breath, her lungs burning. She reached out and took the drive. She plugged it into her terminal, and the screen exploded into a kaleidoscope of flickering red and black code. It was a nightmare of digital noise. To a normal person it was gibberish. To Ellen it was a physical weight pressing against her skull. "It's a Fibonacci spiral," she muttered, her eyes glazing over as she entered the zone. "But the ratio is inverted. It's trying to be a circle, but it's a square. I have to round the corners." For 3 hours, the room was silent except for the frantic clicking of her mechanical keyboard. Frankie watched with suspicion, but Dominic watched with a growing, heavy realization. He was falling for a woman whose mind was a battlefield. He saw the sweat dripping down her neck, the way she bit her lip until it bled, all to satisfy the screaming demand for order in her head. Suddenly, Ellen gasped. "I found it. But, Dominic, it's not just a routing list." She hit a key and a map bloomed onto the screen. It wasn't showing shipping lanes. It was a blueprint of the estate they were currently standing in. Red dots pulsed at the entry points. "It's a hit," she whispered. "The shipment wasn't the goal. The drive was a Trojan horse. They wanted us to bring it here to connect it to the internal network so they could bypass the perimeter sensors." Before Dominic could react, the lights in the estate flickered and died. The silent, perfect world Ellen had built was plunged into a terrifying, uneven darkness. "Frankie, get the men," Dominic roared, pulling a suppressed pistol from his waistband. But the darkness brought something worse for Ellen than the threat of death. It brought the end of her routine. The digital clock on her desk, the one that ticked so perfectly, was dark. The air purifier cut out. The silence was gone, replaced by the heavy, thumping sound of boots on the stairs and the distant shatter of glass. "Dominic," she screamed, her voice breaking. She couldn't see the floor tiles. She couldn't see the corners of the room. The tide wasn't just coming in anymore. It was a tsunami. "I've got you," Dominic said, scooping her up off the chair. He didn't lead her to a panic room. He knew the estate was compromised. He led her toward the service elevator, but as they reached the hallway, a flashbang grenade detonated at the far end. The world turned white. The ringing in Ellen's ears was a high-pitched scream that harmonized with the panic in her brain. When her vision cleared, she was on the floor. Dominic was standing over her, firing into the smoke, his face a mask of primal rage. "Run, Ellen. To the garage. Code 4-4-4-4." He chose the code because he knew her. He knew she would remember a sequence of fours. But as Ellen scrambled toward the hidden door, she saw a shadow emerge from the smoke behind Dominic. It was a man she didn't recognize, holding a heavy tactical rifle. She tried to scream, but her throat was locked. The man didn't fire. He swung the butt of the rifle into the back of Dominic's head. The untouchable Mafia Boss crumpled. "No!" Ellen shrieked, reaching out. The attackers didn't kill him. They grabbed his unconscious body and began dragging him back toward the shattered window where a heavy lift drone or a rappelling team was waiting. They wanted him alive, likely for the same codes and secrets he had used Ellen to protect. One of the men looked back at Ellen. He raised his weapon, but another man grabbed his arm. "Leave her. She's just a broken girl. She's nothing without him." They disappeared into the night, leaving Ellen alone in the wreckage of her perfect room. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing she had ever heard. The man who was her anchor, the only person who looked at her disorder and saw value, was gone. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands shaking so violently she could barely breathe. The floor was covered in glass. The patterns were destroyed. The world was a mess. My friends, my heart is actually racing. Can you imagine the sheer terror of having your only source of safety ripped away while your own mind is turning against you? Ellen is in her darkest place yet, and the only person who can save Dominic is the woman they think is broken. If you're as gripped by this as I am, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Ellen's OCD will be her downfall, or the very thing that helps her track them down? I'm reading all your comments, so let me know where you think she should start. Let's see if she can pull herself together for the sake of love. The dust from the flashbang hung in the air like a shimmering veil of gray lace. Ellen Ripley Gump sat on the floor, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of a floor tile that had been chipped by a stray bullet. To the rest of the world it was just a piece of stone. To Ellen it was a screaming void. The pattern was broken. The sequence of the floor, 12 by 12 squares, now had an imperfection at coordinate 4-9. She felt the familiar, crushing weight of a panic attack beginning to constrict her chest. Her lungs felt like they were filled with sand. Tap the floor 4 times. Smooth the apron. Count the breaths. But as she reached out to perform her ritual, she saw the blood. It wasn't hers. It was a dark crimson smear where Dominic Toretto Corleone's head had hit the floor. The sight of it did something strange to her brain. Usually, blood was a red-level contamination threat. Usually, it would send her into a 3-hour scrubbing frenzy. But this blood was a data point. It was a trail. It was an unfinished line of code in the story of the only man who had ever looked at her and seen a person instead of a problem. "Dominic," she whispered. The name felt like a prayer. She stood up. Her legs were weak, shaking like reeds in a storm, but her mind began to do what it did best. It began to categorize the chaos. She ignored the ringing in her ears and looked at the room through the lens of her disorder. The attackers had been precise, but they weren't perfect. They had left footprints, 6 distinct patterns. 4 were Vibram-soled tactical boots, likely mercenaries. 2 were leather-soled Italian Oxfords. The Moretti family. She noticed the way the smoke was being pulled toward the shattered window. The air pressure was fluctuating in a rhythmic cycle. They didn't use a helicopter, she muttered to herself, her voice gaining a frantic clinical edge. The frequency of the vibration. It was too low. Heavy lift drones. 4 of them. Carrying a payload of approximately 400 pounds. She stumbled toward her desk. The computer was dead, fried by the electromagnetic pulse of the flashbang. But Ellen didn't need the computer. She closed her eyes and visualized the blueprint of the estate she had memorized just minutes before. He saw the red dots. She saw the entry points. She needed to get to the security hub in the basement, but the estate was crawling with the remaining hit squad. She could hear them moving through the halls, their voices echoing in the marble corridors, harsh, uneven sounds that made her teeth ache. She stepped into the hallway. Every few steps she felt the urge to stop and touch the wall 4 times. No. Not now. If I stop, he dies. She forced her hands into her pockets, clenching them into fists until her nails drew blood. She was fighting a war on 2 fronts, the killers in the house and the compulsions in her skull. She reached the service stairs. She knew there were exactly 64 steps to the basement. If she skipped one, she felt like she would vanish into thin air. She counted them under her breath, a rhythmic chant that acted as a shield against the fear. 1, 2, 3, 4. Halfway down, a shadow fell across the landing. One of the mercenaries was standing there, his rifle leveled at the darkness. Ellen froze. Her mind immediately began to scream that his tactical vest was buckled unevenly. The 3rd strap was tighter than the 2nd. It was intolerable. The mercenary turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. It swept over the stairs, missing her by inches. Ellen didn't move. She didn't breathe. She watched the light bounce off the wall. The light is flickering at 60 hertz, she thought. If I move on the offbeat, he won't see the motion. It was a crazy, impossible thought. But for Ellen, the world was nothing but frequencies and patterns. She waited for the rhythm. She slipped past him like a ghost, a shadow moving in the gaps of a strobe light. She reached the basement door just as the man turned back, sensing a shift in the air, but she was already gone. Inside the security hub, the backup generators were kicking in. The servers hummed, a beautiful, steady 440 Hz tone. It was the first thing that had felt right since the explosion. She bypassed the biometric lock, not with a hack but by observing the wear and tear on the keypad. The 4, 7, 1, and 9 keys were microscopically more polished than the others. There were only 24 possible combinations. He tried the one that followed the golden ratio first. The door hissed open. She lunged for the main terminal. Her fingers flew across the keys, her OCD driving her to hit them with a specific alternating pressure. She bypassed the EMP-shielded logs and pulled up the drone's flight path. "They're going to the old shipyard," she whispered, watching the flickering dots move toward the coast. Pier 44. But then a new window popped up. A communication intercept. Package secured. Moretti wants the girl to send the cleanup crew back to the suite. She knows too much about the encryption. Ellen felt a cold spike of terror. They were coming back for her. But more importantly, she saw a secondary data stream. The drones weren't just transport. They were rigged with a remote detonation failsafe. If Dominic tried to escape or if anyone followed too closely, the drones would explode, taking him with them. The romance she had built with Dominic. The quiet nights of sorting coins, the way he would hold her hand to stop the shaking. It wasn't just a comfort anymore. It was her motivation. She realized she wasn't staying with him because he made her world quiet. She was staying because, for the first time in her life, she cared about something more than the patterns in her head. She grabbed a mobile decryption unit and a tactical headset. She had to get to Pier 44. But she couldn't drive. The unpredictability of traffic, the unevenness of the road, it was one of her greatest triggers. "I have to," she sobbed, staring at the car keys hanging on the wall. "I have to. 4-4-4-4. I am literally holding my breath, everyone." Ellen is doing the one thing she fears most, stepping into a world she can't control. All to save the man who accepted her exactly as she is. This is the definition of true courage, isn't it? It's not the absence of fear, but moving forward even when your own mind is telling you to stop. If you're rooting for Ellen to make it to that shipyard, please make sure you're subscribed. I want to hear from you. What's the one thing you've done for love that absolutely terrified you? Let's talk about it in the comments. We're moving into the heart of the storm now. The drive to the coast was a descent into a private purgatory. Ellen gripped the steering wheel of the black armored SUV at exactly 10:02, her knuckles so white they looked like polished marble. Every time the tires hit a pothole, an uneven, jarring rupture in the road, a jolt of electricity shot up her spine. The world outside the windshield was a chaotic blur of neon signs and mismatched streetlights, a sensory assault that threatened to shatter her focus. Focus on the lines, she told herself, her voice a ragged chant. Stay between the lines. The lines are safe. The lines are constant. She reached Pier 44 20 minutes before the drones were scheduled to land. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and skeletal cranes, silhouettes against a bruised purple sky. It was a place of jagged edges and decay, the exact environment that usually triggered Ellen's most violent spirals. She parked the car with obsessive precision, aligning the tires perfectly with the concrete seam of the dock. She pulled the mobile decryption unit from the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she adjusted her tactical headset. "Dominic," she whispered, her eyes scanning the horizon. I'm here. 1, 2, 3, 4. She tapped into the shipyard's local network, her mind slicing through the firewalls with the ease of a hot wire through wax. But as the data began to stream across her tablet, she saw something that stopped her heart. She wasn't just looking at the Moretti family's tactical logs. She had accidentally breached a deeper, hidden partition within Dominic's own encrypted files, the ones he had kept behind a 999 firewall. These weren't files about shipments or rivals. These were files about her. Her breath hitched. She scrolled through the data, her eyes wide. There were medical records dating back to her childhood. There were psychiatric evaluations she didn't remember taking. And then she saw the time-stamped logs from the restaurant where she had worked as a waitress. Dominic hadn't met her by chance. He hadn't discovered her brilliance the day she walked into that meeting. The logs showed he had been watching her for 6 months. He had tracked her routines, mapped her compulsions and calculated her breaking points. He had orchestrated the crisis with the 20 experts. The unsolvable cipher had been a test, a choreographed moment designed to draw her out of the kitchen and into his world. He hadn't fallen for her courage. He had engineered her dependence. The gifts, the quiet clock, the air purifier, the precision pens, they weren't tokens of affection. They were calibration tools. He had been tuning her like an instrument, making her world just quiet enough that she would function as his ultimate processor, but just unstable enough that she would never leave the safety of his shadow. The romance, the way he held her hand, it was all a variable in an equation of control. "No," Ellen breathed, the tablet slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the floorboards. "No, he said he loved the honesty. He said we were a matched set." The revelation was a tectonic shift. The tide, in her head surged, a roar of static that drowned out the sound of the ocean. Her anchor wasn't a savior. He was a captor who had used her mental illness as a leash. The betrayal felt like a physical blade between her ribs. For a moment she wanted to turn the key and drive away. To let the Morettis have him. To let the chaos consume the man who had turned her mind into a weapon. But then a new signal flared on the monitor. The drones were approaching. On the thermal feed she saw Dominic. He was tied to a chair in the center of an empty warehouse, his head lolling. He looked broken. He looked human. And then she saw the Moretti enforcer, Frankie Costello-Vane. Wait, Frankie? Her mind, even through the haze of betrayal, caught the anomaly. Frankie was Dominic's right hand. But here he was on the thermal feed, standing over Dominic, checking the timer on the detonation failsafe. The betrayal went deeper than she could have imagined. This wasn't just a kidnapping by a rival family. This was a coup. Frankie had used the Morettis to clear the way so he could take over the Corleone Empire, and he was using the drones to ensure Dominic was erased permanently. Ellen stared at the screen. Her mind was a storm of conflicting patterns. The man she loved had manipulated her. The man he trusted had betrayed him. The world was a mess of lies, filth, and uneven numbers. But as she looked at Dominic's slumped form on the screen, she saw his hand. His fingers were moving. Even semi-conscious, he was tapping his thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was doing her ritual. He wasn't doing it to mock her. He was doing it because in his moment of greatest agony, the only thing that gave him strength was the rhythm he had learned from her. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. Maybe the beginning was a lie. Maybe the setup was a calculation. But the man tapping that rhythm wasn't a boss or a manipulator. He was a man who had finally found the one thing his money couldn't buy. A reason to want to be stable. He needs me, she whispered, her resolve hardening into something sharper than her OCD. And he needs me to be exactly who I am. She grabbed the tablet. She didn't try to suppress the compulsions this time. She leaned into them. She let the hyperfocus take over, her fingers moving across the screen in a blur of perfect rhythmic taps. She wasn't just going to solve the problem. He was going to rewrite the entire sequence. My friends, I am absolutely shaken. To find out that your entire relationship was a calculated move. I don't know if I could ever forgive that. But Ellen sees something we don't. She sees a man who reached for her rhythm when his own world fell apart. Do you think love can grow out of a lie? Or is Ellen just falling back into another pattern? Please, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and join our community. I want to hear your theories on Frankie's betrayal in the comments. Things are reaching a boiling point and the clock is ticking. The shipyard was a skeleton of rusted iron and salt spray, a place where the wind didn't just blow. It shrieked through the gaps in the shipping containers in an irregular, dissonant pitch that set Ellen's teeth on edge. She was crouched behind a stack of rotted timber, her tablet the only source of light in a world that had gone pitch black. The drones landed. The sound was a mechanical swarm, a 4-point descent that vibrated in the soles of her feet. As the rotors wound down, the silence that followed was even worse. It was the silence of a tomb. Through her long-range directional mic, she heard the heavy thud of the cargo being unloaded. Check the vitals, Frankie's voice crackled through her headset. If he's too far gone, he can't give us the access codes to the offshore accounts. We need him conscious enough to speak, then we let the failsafe do its job. Ellen watched the thermal feed. They were dragging Dominic into the center of Warehouse 4. The number 4 should have brought her comfort, but tonight, it felt like a curse. She saw the heat signatures of 12 men, Frankie's elite traders, forming a jagged, uneven perimeter around the building. She tried to tap into the drone's detonation sequence, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The revelation from Part 5, the files, the logs, the cold calculation of her life, was a poison in her bloodstream. He watched me, she thought, her eyes stinging. He didn't find me. He trapped me. Like a specimen in a jar. The tide surged. Suddenly, the patterns she relied on felt like they were mocking her. Why should she fix the code? Why should she make things symmetrical when the man she was saving was the architect of her own chaos? Her mind began to spiral into a recursive loop. If the love was a lie, the stability was a lie. If the stability was a lie, the world was random. And if the world was random, there was no point in counting. I can't do this, she sobbed, pulling the headset off and letting it hang around her neck. I can't, it doesn't matter. It's all broken. She looked at her hands. The red, raw skin on her knuckles seemed to glow in the moonlight. She felt the urge to wash them, to scrub until the skin came off, to erase the touch of the man who had manipulated her. The compulsion was a physical roar in her ears, drowning out the mission, the danger, and the ticking clock. Inside the warehouse, a scream tore through the night. It was Dominic. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of agony. Through the thin walls of the warehouse, she heard the wet thud of a strike, then another. Frankie wasn't waiting for the codes anymore. He was enjoying the dismantling of a king. Where is she, Dominic? Frankie's voice was a low snarl. Where did you hide the waitress? The girl is the key to the vault. Tell me where she is and I'll make the explosion quick. There was a long silence, punctuated only by the drip of water from a leaky pipe. Then Dominic spoke. His voice was broken, wet with blood, but it held a terrifying clarity. She's not a key, Frankie, Dominic rasped. She's the whole damn lock. And you aren't smart enough to even touch the door. You think you can use her? She'd see through you in 60 seconds. She'd see every uneven thought in your head until you went mad. I don't need her to like me, Frankie laughed. I just need her to fear me. She doesn't fear anything but the noise, Dominic whispered. And I'm the only one who knows how to be quiet for her. You're just noise, Frankie. And noise gets cancelled. A heavy blow silenced him. Ellen froze. The tide didn't go out, but it changed. She looked at the tablet. The timer on the drone failsafe had been activated. 5 o'clock, 4:59. In 5 minutes the warehouse would be leveled. Frankie and his men were planning to exit through the rear tunnel, leaving Dominic tied to the center of the blast zone. Ellen was alone. She had no weapon. She had no backup. Her mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting 100 different versions of a betrayal. She looked at the warehouse, then at the car. She could leave. She could find a new city, a new routine, a new cage. But then she saw it. On the ground near the warehouse door was a discarded cigarette pack. It was lying at a 45-degree angle to the doorframe. A memory flashed. Dominic leaning against the balcony of the estate, moving a stray leaf off the table because he knew it would bother her. He hadn't just watched her to control her. He had learned her language so he could speak to her. Even if the beginning was a lie, the man who was currently dying for her location had become the person she needed him to be. The despair didn't vanish, but it sharpened into a singular, cold point of focus. The noise, she whispered, her eyes turning back to the code. He called them noise. She put the headset back on. The shaking didn't stop, but she incorporated it into the rhythm. She didn't fight the OCD, she used it as a high-speed processor. She began to flood the warehouse's internal frequency with a localized white noise loop, a perfect, unchanging 440 Hz tone. But as she worked, a shadow loomed over her. One of Frankie's sentries had found her car. The man leveled a shotgun at the driver's side window, his face twisted in a grin. Found the little bird, he muttered into his radio. Ellen looked at the barrel of the gun. The world slowed down. He saw the grooves in the metal. She saw the way the man's finger was positioned, slightly off-center on the trigger. The situation was hopeless. She was trapped in a car, a gun to her head, with a 3-minute countdown to the death of the only person she had ever loved. I am shaking as I write this, my friends. This is the moment where everything falls apart. Ellen is facing the ultimate choice. Does she succumb to the betrayal and the fear, or does she find a way to turn her brokenness into a shield? I need you to stay with me. If you're feeling the weight of this moment, please leave a comment. Tell Ellen to stay strong. And if you haven't subscribed, now is the time. We are entering the final stretch, and I promise you, you don't want to miss how this ends. The barrel of the shotgun tapped against the glass of the SUV, a rhythmic metallic clink that should have sent Ellen into a catatonic state. To any other observer, Ellen Ripley Gump was a cornered animal, a fragile girl with trembling hands and a mind that was currently dissolving into a million jagged pieces. The sentry, a man whose name was likely as unremarkable as his cruelty, leaned in, his breath fogging the window. Out of the car, sweetheart, he sneered. Frankie's gonna want to see the genius who's been hiding in the dark. But Ellen wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the reflection of the warehouse in the glass. She was looking at the way the light from the drone's status LEDs flickered against the rusted siding. 1-2-3 off. 1-2-3 off. Inside her mind, a massive rusted gear began to turn. The tide of her disorder, the overwhelming, suffocating force that had ruled her life since childhood, didn't recede. It surged forward and coalesced into a laser-focused beam of pure computational power. For the first time in her life, she didn't try to push the noise away. She invited it in. He became the noise. The safety is on, she said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of the tremor that had defined it for years. The sentry blinked. What? The safety on your Remington 870. You haven't engaged the primary sear because the spring is misaligned by 2 millimeters. If you pull that trigger, the firing pin will jam. It's an uneven mechanical failure. It's unacceptable. The man hesitated, his eyes darting down to his weapon for a fraction of a second. That was the only window she needed. Ellen didn't use a weapon. She used the car. She slammed the gear shift into reverse and floored the accelerator. The heavy armored door, which she had purposefully left unlatched by exactly 1 inch, swung outward with the force of a wrecking ball. It caught the sentry in the chest, hurling him backward into a stack of shipping pallets. She didn't wait to see if he got up. She grabbed her tablet and dived out of the passenger side, rolling into the shadows of a container. "Dominic," she whispered, her fingers flying across the screen. "Hold on. Just hold on." The betrayal she had discovered in the files still burned like acid in her gut, but the turning point had arrived in her heart. She realized that while Dominic had engineered their meeting, he couldn't engineer her reaction. He had provided the structure, but she had provided the soul. And in the warehouse, as he faced death, he was using her rituals to stay sane. He wasn't her captor anymore, he was her counterpart. She breached the drone's command frequency. 215, 214. The code was a mess. A jagged, ugly script written by Frankie's low-level hackers. It was offensive to her sensibilities. It was a series of if-then statements that left too much to chance. "I can fix this," she muttered, her eyes glowing with the reflected blue light of the screen. "I can make it perfect." She didn't just try to disarm the bomb. That was what they expected. Instead, she rewrote the drone's internal GPS. She mapped the warehouse in 3D, identifying the exact structural weaknesses of the roof. She saw the 4 in everything: the 4 support pillars, the 4 main crossbeams, the 4 drones. If she could synchronize the detonation, she wouldn't just blow up the warehouse. She could create a directed implosion. A vacuum that would drop the roof onto the perimeter guards while leaving the center of the room, where Dominic was tied, completely untouched. It required a precision of 0.0001 seconds. It was a mathematical impossibility for a human. But Ellen wasn't just human tonight. She was a machine of pure, beautiful compulsion. "Ellen." A voice boomed over the shipyard's PA system. It was Frankie. "I know you're out there. I can see your signal pinging the network. Give it up. In 2 minutes this whole pier goes to hell and you go with it." Ellen ignored him. She was counting the beats of the drone's rotors. She was aligning her heartbeat with the processor clock. Suddenly her headset crackled. It was a low-frequency bypass she had set up earlier. "Ellen." It was Dominic. His voice was a thread of sound, barely a ghost. "Dominic, don't speak," she whispered, tears finally breaking through her focus and blurring the screen. "I'm here. I'm fixing the pattern. I'm sorry," he coughed, the sound of blood clear in his throat. "The files, the restaurant. I wanted to find someone who could see what I couldn't. I didn't think I'd actually want to be seen." "Be quiet, Dominic," she said, her thumb hovering over the execute command. "You're making too much noise. I need you to be still. I need you to be 0-0 on my grid. Do you understand? You are the center of the world. Don't move." "Always," he whispered. Hope, a feeling so foreign it felt like a new limb, sprouted in her chest. She wasn't saving him because she had to. She wasn't saving him because her mind demanded order. She was saving him because he was the only person who understood that her brokenness was actually her greatest light. She saw the guards closing in on her position. She saw Frankie exiting the rear of the warehouse, his thumb on the remote detonator. 3, 1. Frankie grinned and pressed the button. But Ellen had already hit enter. "I am literally standing up right now, my friends. Can you feel that? The moment where the victim becomes the victor. Where the broken girl becomes the architect of her own destiny. This is why we never count anyone out." Ellen just took control of a mafia war with nothing but a tablet and a mind that refuses to accept a mistake. If you are cheering for her right now, please show some love in the comments and hit that subscribe button. We are headed into the climax. Will her mathematical miracle work? Let's find out. The world didn't explode in the way Frankie Vane expected. When he pressed that detonator, he expected a chaotic orange mushroom cloud to swallow Warehouse 4 and erase his past along with his boss. Instead, there was a sound like a synchronized intake of breath. 4 sharp, high-pitched chirps as the drones Ellen had subverted fired their thrusters in reverse. 1 second, midnight. The explosion was a masterpiece of physics. Because Ellen had rewrote the sequence to force the drones into a localized, downward-facing blast, the roof of the warehouse didn't fly outward. It folded inward. The 4 corners of the building collapsed with surgical precision, the heavy corrugated steel and concrete beams slamming down like the teeth of a trap. Outside, the perimeter guards were swept off their feet by the shockwave, buried under the cascading debris of the outer walls. But in the very center of the floor, at coordinate 0-0, a miracle of geometry was taking place. Ellen had calculated the triangle of life within the structural blueprint. By dropping the north and south beams at a specific 32-degree angle, she had created a hollow, reinforced tent of steel directly over Dominic. While the rest of the warehouse was pulverized into a graveyard of twisted metal and dust, Dominic Toretto Corleone sat in a pocket of absolute dusty silence, untouched. Ellen didn't wait for the dust to settle. She was running. She ignored the jagged glass that cut her palms as she climbed over the rubble. She ignored the uneven piles of brick that would have sent her into a screaming fit only hours ago. Her world was no longer about 12 by 12 tiles or color-coded pens. It was about the heat signature she could still see on her tablet, pulsing steady and red in the heart of the wreckage. "Dominic," she screamed, her voice tearing through the settle of the dust. "Over here, little bird." The voice came from beneath a slanted slab of reinforced concrete. Ellen threw herself onto her knees, digging at the debris with her bare hands. Her starched apron was ruined, soaked in oil and grime, but she didn't care. She cleared a gap and there he was. He was covered in gray silt, his face bruised and bloodied, but his eyes were wide and focused on her. 60 seconds, he coughed, a pained but genuine smile breaking through the grit. "You cracked the sequence in 60 seconds and you rewrote the laws of physics in 10. I told you, you're the whole damn lock." She reached in, her fingers interlacing with his. For the first time she didn't think about the germs or the sweat. She just felt the pulse in his wrist. A rhythmic, steady beat that was the only pattern that mattered. "I saw the files, Dominic," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw how you found me." Dominic's expression softened into something vulnerable, stripped of the Mafia Boss's armor. "I found you because I was drowning, Ellen. I spent my life in a world where everything is random violence and betrayal. I needed to see someone who believed in an order that couldn't be bought. I started as a predator, but I stayed as a devotee. I didn't just want your mind. I wanted to learn how to breathe the way you do." But the moment of reunion was shattered by the sound of a pistol slide racking. "Touching," Frankie Vane spat. He was standing atop a pile of rubble 10 feet away, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his handgun leveled at Ellen's head. A beautiful story of redemption. Too bad it ends in a scrapyard. Frankie's hand was shaking. He was a man who lived for the chaos, but he was currently looking at a woman who had just tamed a bomb with a tablet. He was terrified of her. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, girl," Frankie snarled. "Now you're just another uneven variable I have to delete." Ellen looked at Frankie. She didn't feel the panic. She didn't feel the tide. She looked at the way he held the gun, the slight tilt of his wrist, the way his feet were planted at an asymmetrical angle on the loose bricks. "You're standing on a 14-degree incline, Frankie," she said, her voice cold and analytical. "What?" "The bricks beneath your left heel. They aren't anchored. They're part of the drainage grate I collapsed during the implosion. If you apply 3 more pounds of pressure to your trigger finger, your center of gravity will shift 2.4 centimeters to the left." Frankie sneered, his finger tightening. "You think your math can save you now?" "It's not my math," Ellen said, her eyes narrowing. "It's your lack of it." She reached out and pulled a loose wire she had been holding in her left hand, the manual override for the drone's remaining battery pack, which was still wedged in the rubble near Frankie's feet. But the small electrical discharge was just enough. It didn't blow up, but it hissed with a high-voltage arc. Frankie flinched, his foot shifting just as Ellen predicted. The loose bricks beneath him gave way. He plummeted backward into the dark void of the drainage pit, his gun firing harmlessly into the night sky as he vanished into the jagged depths of the shipyard's underbelly. Silence returned to Pier 44. A perfect, heavy, symmetrical silence. Ellen turned back to Dominic. She pulled him from the wreckage, her strength fueled by a surge of adrenaline that defied her small frame. As he leaned against her, his weight heavy and real, she realized the greatest twist of all. Her OCD hadn't been a cage she needed to escape. It was the armor she had been wearing all along. And the man leaning on her wasn't her keeper. He was the person who finally gave her a reason to use that armor for something more than survival. I am literally out of my seat. My heart is pounding for Ellen. She didn't just save the day. She used the very thing that made her feel broken to outmaneuver a room full of killers. That is the ultimate triumph. If you've ever felt like your weakness was actually a secret weapon, I want to hear about it in the comments right now. Go on, tell your story. And if you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? We are about to see how this incredible journey concludes. Does love really fix everything, or is there a new pattern beginning? Let's finish this. The first rays of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, painting the shipyard in hues of soft gold and pale lavender. It was a yellow day, Ellen noted, but for the first time in 24 years, the color didn't dictate her mood. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and the ozone of the night's electrical storms, and as the sirens of Dominic's loyalists finally began to wail in the distance, the world felt strangely quiet. Dominic sat on the bumper of the armored SUV, a medic wrapping a clean white bandage around his ribs. He watched Ellen. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't counting the buttons on the medic's jacket. She was standing at the edge of the pier, looking out at the water, her hands resting loosely at her sides. He stood up, waving off the medical team, and walked over to her. He stopped exactly 3 feet away, respecting the perimeter he knew she needed. "The estate is being cleaned," Dominic said softly. "The files, the ones you found, they've been deleted. All of them. There are no more logs, Ellen. No more observers. From this second on, the only person who knows your patterns is you." Ellen turned to look at him. Her face was smudged with soot and her hair was a tangled mess, but her eyes were clear. "You lied to me at the start, Dominic. You created a crisis just to see if I could solve it. You played with my head when it was already a storm." Dominic nodded, his expression heavy with a regret he couldn't hide. "I did. I was a man who saw the world as a series of assets to be acquired. I thought I was buying a solution. I didn't realize I was meeting the person who would make me want to be a better man." He took a hesitant step forward. "I won't ask you to stay for the job. The waitress is retired. The expert is free. If you want to walk away, I've set up an account, symmetrical numbers just the way you like, that will ensure you never have to count a penny for the rest of your life." Ellen looked at his hand, the one that had held hers in the darkness of the warehouse. She thought about the tide in her head. It was still there, the distant hum of numbers and the need for order, but it didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a heartbeat. "I spent my whole life trying to make the world perfect so I could feel safe," she said, her voice steady. "But last night the world was falling apart. It was messy and violent and completely out of order. And I wasn't scared because of the mess, Dominic. I was scared because I thought I'd lost the only person who finally made the silence feel real." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers sliding into the spaces between his. "I don't stay because I need stability. I stayed because I love you. And love is the only thing that doesn't have to be symmetrical to be right." 6 months later, the city's underworld was a different place. The Corleone name was still whispered with fear, but the way the empire was run had changed. There were no more unsolvable leaks. No more chaotic betrayals. The business was run with a clinical mathematical precision that baffled rivals and delighted allies. In a quiet villa overlooking the Mediterranean, far from the grime of the shipyards, Alan Ripley Gump sat at a desk made of solid, polished oak. On the desk were 3 things: a laptop glowing with encrypted data, a vase with exactly 4 roses, and a small vintage coin that Dominic had given her, minted in a year that was a perfect square. She didn't tap the desk. She didn't count her breaths. She simply worked. The door opened and Dominic walked in. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear or his expensive silk suits. He was wearing a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up. He walked over and kissed the top of her head. "The shipment is on time," he whispered. "To the second." Ellen smiled, leaning back into him. Her mind was still a garden of numbers, a place of infinite patterns and beautiful, complex sequences. But the tide was calm. The romance that had started as a coping mechanism had become her cure. She realized that she hadn't found peace because she fixed the world. She found peace because she found someone who was willing to stand in the middle of the chaos with her. She looked at the screen, then at the man she loved. Everything was in its place. Not because it had to be, but because it was exactly where it belonged. My friends, we have reached the end of Ellen and Dominic's journey. It's a powerful reminder that our struggles don't define us. They can be the very things that lead us to our greatest victories. Ellen didn't fix her OCD. She mastered it, and she found a love that didn't ask her to be anything other than herself. I want to thank you so much for staying with me through every twist and turn of this 40-minute story. It's been an emotional ride, and I've loved reading your comments along the way. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It means the world to me and helps me keep creating these stories for you. Before you go, I have a question. What was your favorite twist in Ellen's journey? Was it the revelation of the secret files, or the way she used the drones to create a safe zone? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, your mind is a gift, even the parts that feel broken. Stay wonderful.